April 23, 1945. Guam. For nearly 3 months, Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz has run the Pacific War from a hilltop on this island. A desk, a row of telephones, dispatches crossing it by the hundreds, every day, from a fleet spread across more ocean than any single command has ever covered before. Down the hill from his quarters, the staff cars never stopped pulling in. Dispatch riders, couriers with the morning intelligence summaries. The war does not pause long enough for him to step outside it. He does not go to the front. He has officers for that. Spruance runs the fleet. Turner runs the landings. A war this size moves on cables, not on boot leather. Today, that changes. Today, Nimitz gets on a plane himself. He lands on an island that has not stopped burning since the 1st of April. Smoke still hangs over the southern hills. Out past the reef, the radar picket destroyers are standing their watch, the way they have stood it for 3 weeks straight, waiting on the next wave out of Kyushu. Nimitz has not come to inspect anything. He has come to see one man. Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. commands the 10th Army, the force grinding its way south through a Japanese defense dug so deep into the island's coral spine that naval gunfire barely touches it. 3 weeks in, his infantry is gaining ground in yards. Some days, less. Every day, Buckner's line stays where it is. Nimitz's ships stay tied to the water off Okinawa, within range, within reach of pilots flying down from Kyushu with no plan to come home. He finds Buckner. No officers cleared from the room, no raised voice, just one admiral, looking at one general, saying the thing months of dispatches had failed to say. "I'm losing a ship and a half a day." A pause. "So, if this line isn't moving in 5 days, we'll get someone up here to move it, so we can get out from under these damn kamikaze attacks." 5 days. Then he is gone again. Back to the plane. Back to Guam. Back to the maps and the cables. No reporter is standing there to write it down. No camera catches it. The only reason anyone knows what was said is that the men standing nearby remembered it, because it was the kind of sentence a man doesn't forget hearing. A ship and a half a day is not a number. It is destroyers. It is the boys standing watch on them, 18, 19 years old, scanning a gray sky for a plane that means to kill them on purpose, and will not be talked out of it. Nimitz had spent 30 years learning how to read a casualty report without flinching. He had spent every one of those years learning which numbers he would not let stand. What does it take to make a man leave a war room he has run for more than 3 years and stand in front of someone else's army, just to say one sentence? That question has an answer. It starts 3 weeks earlier, on a beach that should not have been this easy to take. Somewhere in that fleet. There was a young man who never told you the whole story. If this might be a piece of his story too, hit like for him. He earned that a long time ago. April 1st, 1945. Easter Sunday and April Fool's Day, on the same morning, on the other side of the world, from anyone keeping track of the irony. The men climbing down into landing craft off Okinawa are not thinking about either one. Iwo Jima had been declared secure less than a week earlier. Before that, Peleliu. Before that, Tarawa. Every one of those beaches taught the same lesson, paid for in the same coin. The Japanese do not fight for the sand. They let the beach go and make you pay for every yard after it. So the Marines and soldiers hitting the shore at Higuchi brace for the worst morning of their lives. It doesn't come. They wade in standing upright. No mortars walking the beach, no machine guns out of the tree line. Men who crawled the last 3 landings on their stomachs walk this one like a drill back in California. By nightfall, 60,000 men are ashore. 2 airfields already belong to the United States. Some of the men spend that first evening walking the high ground around Yontan and Kadena, looking for a fight that never shows up. A few try the local fruit growing wild along the terraced hillsides. Somebody finds a goat and argues about keeping it. After 3 landings that opened with the worst few minutes of their lives, an entire division stands around on a Pacific island with nothing to shoot at. A week into the landing, with resistance still nowhere to be found. Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner cannot quite believe what he is looking at. He sends word back to Nimitz at the advance headquarters on Guam. "I may be crazy," he writes, "but it looks like the Japanese have quit the war, at least in this sector." Nimitz reads it. He does not share the optimism. "Delete all after crazy," he sends back. He is not being unkind. He has done this since December of 1941. He has watched easy landings turn into 3-month grinds before more than once, and he knows the Japanese have not gone anywhere. They have simply chosen, this time, to let the beach go. He is proven right within 5 days. The fight that mattered most in the campaign's first weeks had nothing to do with the beach at all. It had already happened, before a single Marine waded ashore. Weeks earlier, while carrier pilots were still working over the airfields of Kyushu, Nimitz had gone after something he had no authority to take. He wanted Army Air Force bombers, the same B-29s burning Japanese cities by night, turned against the airfields where Japan's Kamikaze squadrons were forming up. Major General Curtis LeMay did not want to give them to him. LeMay ran the strategic bombing campaign against Japanese industry, and as far as he was concerned, parking his bombers over a string of airstrips to protect somebody else's ships was somebody else's war. Nimitz was not in LeMay's chain of command. He had no order he could give that LeMay was bound to follow. CINCPAC and the 20th Air Force answered to different masters, and LeMay's masters wanted Tokyo in ashes, not a string of airfields on Kyushu. Nimitz made his case through channels that were not built for this kind of argument, and he kept making it until it held. On March 29th, and again on March 31st, B-29s that were supposed to be over Tokyo dropped their bombs on Kyushu instead. It did not stop what was coming. Nothing was going to stop what was coming. On April 6th, it came. 400 Japanese aircraft launched out of Kyushu that afternoon, more than half of them flown by pilots with no intention of landing again. The Japanese called it kikusui, floating chrysanthemums. It was not a raid. It was the opening of something the United States Navy had never faced before, and would never face again at this scale. An enemy air arm built entirely around the certainty of its own destruction. The American answer to it had already been built before the first plane ever took off. A ring of destroyers pushed out to the edges of the formation, carrying radar and little else to recommend the assignment. Early warning, first contact, first target. The men standing that watch had a name for it within the first week. They called it the Bull's Eye. Behind them, Marine Corsairs held close to the ships themselves, the last line before a kamikaze ever got within gun range. Further out, Navy fighters off the carriers reached 50 miles ahead of the fleet to meet the incoming raids before they ever crossed into sight of a single ship. Combat air patrols stacked overhead from dawn to dusk, landing, refueling, rearming, launching again, on flight decks that never stopped moving. It was not a perfect system. Nothing built that fast against a threat that new ever is. But on April 6, 1945, for the first time, the United States Navy stood and met an enemy that had given up on surviving the war, with men who had not. No one ordered that fleet to hold its ground under that kind of weather. It simply never went anywhere. That spring, the men fighting ashore gave the Fifth Fleet a nickname of its own. They called it the fleet that came to stay. It was not a compliment handed out for nothing. On picket ships up and down the line, gun crews kept loading after the barrels ran hot enough to blister a bare hand through a glove. Captains held their stations with holes already torn through the hull, because the destroyers behind them still needed the warning those radar screens were giving. On April 6th, the first day of the mass attacks, Kamikazes found 2 ammunition ships, Logan Victory and Hobbs Victory, and sent both to the bottom. The shells they were carrying were the same shells Buckner's artillery needed to break the Japanese line ashore. The convoys behind them did not stop coming. They could not. The infantry on the beach needed what was in those holds more than the Navy needed to keep its ships out of range. Nobody ordered any of that. There was no regulation requiring a damaged ship to keep firing instead of falling out of formation and heading for repairs. No order compelling the next convoy to sail into water that had just swallowed the last one. The fleet did it because the alternative was leaving the men on the beach with nothing standing between them and the next wave out of Kyushu. At Guam, the reports reached Nimitz every day. Not the casualty lists first. Those came later, in the official tallies. What came first were the operational summaries. Ships hit, ships sunk, ships still on station despite both. Spruance and Turner had been pressing Buckner for weeks to move the ground line faster, to shorten the time the fleet spent tied to a beachhead under fire from the sky. The pressing had not worked. By the 4th week of April, Nimitz had read enough of those summaries to get on a plane himself. What happened next has already been told. 18 days after he stood in front of Buckner and said his piece, the fleet was still doing exactly what it had been doing since the 6th of April. On May 11th, it did it better than anyone thought a single ship could. That morning, at Radar Picket Station 15, northwest of Okinawa, the destroyer USS Hugh W. Hadley took her station alongside her sister ship Evans and 4 smaller support craft. At 7:45, a single Japanese float plane came in low over the water, low enough to slip past the radar. Hadley's lookouts caught it by eye, and her gunners shot it down, close aboard, before it ever reached the formation. For a few minutes, the morning went quiet again. Then radar picked up a formation that would grow to roughly 150 Japanese aircraft, the 6th mass kamikaze raid of the campaign. Marine Corsairs flying combat air patrol overhead met them first, shooting down so many that some pilots ran out of ammunition and started forcing kamikazes into the water by flying alongside them and riding them down, wingtip to wingtip, until the Japanese pilots lost control rather than reach the ships at all. It was not enough to stop all of them. For nearly 2 hours, Hadley's gun crews never stopped firing. Her captain, Commander Mullaney, held the ship in the fight the entire time. Evans fought the same fight beside her until kamikaze hits left her dead in the water a little before 9 o'clock. Hadley kept going alone. At 9:20, 10 planes came at her at once, from the bow and the stern in the same breath. Her gunners tracked them, fired, and brought down all 10 before a single one reached the hull. Her luck ran out minutes later. A bomb. A piloted rocket bomb the Japanese called Oka. 2 more kamikazes in quick succession. By the time the attack finally broke off, Hadley had downed 23 aircraft in an hour and 40 minutes, a record no other ship in the United States Navy would match in a single engagement, before or since. Her gunners had fired more than 15,000 rounds to do it. She did not sink. Below decks, damage control parties worked through flooded compartments to keep her afloat, while the gunners above them kept firing. She made it to Aishima under her own power. Then to Karama Reto, for repairs that could only hold her together. Then on a tow line, all the way back to San Francisco. Her crew brought her home. The Navy gave her a Presidential Unit citation. The men who served on her gave her a name that stuck longer than any citation ever could. the champion Kamikaze killer. Nobody aboard was thinking about a fleet nickname when the shooting started. They were thinking about the next plane, and the one after it, and the one after that. The nickname was something other people gave them afterward, for not doing the one thing that would have been easiest: cutting the engines, signaling for help, waiting to be saved. They never signaled for that. In the same week, the kamikaze attacks began. The Imperial Japanese Navy made one last throw with the largest battleship it had ever built. On the evening of April 6th, the battleship Yamato left the anchorage at Tokuyama. Beside her sailed the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers. Nobody aboard carried enough fuel for a return voyage. The orders were simple, and they were final. Fight through to Okinawa. Run the ship aground on the beach if she made it that far. Use her 18-inch guns, the largest ever mounted on any warship, as a fixed battery for as long as she could still fire them. And let her crew finish the war as infantry once the guns went silent. There was no air cover assigned to her. Japan had almost nothing left to fly. 2 American submarines, Threadfin and Hackleback, picked her up coming out of the Bungo Strait that same evening and radioed her course back to the fleet. By morning, Admiral Mark Mitcher had everything he needed to know exactly where to look. He launched 386 aircraft off 15 carriers. Fighters first, to silence her anti-aircraft guns. Dive bombers next, to wreck her radar and her fire control. Torpedo planes last, skimming the wave tops at 200 feet, aiming for the one place 18 inches of steel could not protect her: the hull, below the waterline, on a single side, over and over, until the ship could no longer counter-flood fast enough to stay upright. The first wave found her at 12:32 in the afternoon on April 7th. For close to 2 hours, Yamato's gunners answered everything that came at them. It made no difference. Nothing in her arsenal had been built to answer an attack that arrived from the sky in these numbers, because no navy on Earth had ever needed to design one before. By 2:05, with her list past the point, any gun could still be trained against gravity. The order came to abandon ship. Many of the men below decks never received it. At 2:20, she rolled over. 3 minutes later, her forward magazines went up. 500 tons of ammunition, in one explosion. A fireball that climbed 6 kilometers into the sky. Of her crew of 3,332, 269 survived. The Yahagi and 4 of her 8 escorting destroyers went down with her. American losses that day: 10 aircraft. The largest battleship ever put to sea had been built around an idea more than 60 years old: that the nation with the biggest guns, mounted on the thickest steel, wins the next war at sea. Japan had poured more of its national treasure into Yamato than into any warship in its history, betting everything that the idea would hold one more time. It did not hold for one afternoon. Carrier aircraft sank her before her main guns ever fired a single round at an American ship. There is one more detail about that ship worth knowing, and it has nothing to do with steel or guns. Yamato was not just a name picked for a battleship. It is the old, poetic word for Japan itself, the name the country called itself before it had any other. The Imperial Navy had built its flagship out of the nation's own ancient name. In April of 1945, in under 2 hours, off a coast nobody back home could find on a map, American carrier pilots sank it. Chester Nimitz had bet against that whole way of thinking 3 decades earlier. Back when he was a young officer arguing for submarines, nobody in Washington particularly wanted to fund. The argument had never really been about submarines, or carriers, or any one weapon. It was about which navy understood first that the age of the battleship had an ending, and built itself ready for the day it came. Before that sentence ever reached Buckner, Spruance and Turner had already tried saying something close to it. Not in person. By cable. The way two admirals normally talk to an army general they do not command and have no authority to order around. Spruance was holding the fleet together under kamikaze attacks that never seemed to let up. Turner was still running supply convoys into the same waters, into the same risk. Every day, the ground campaign stayed in place. Both men watched the advance stall in front of the Japanese defenses at Shuri, week after week, and both sent word up the chain that the pace had to change. The cables went out. The pace did not change much. On April 20th, after weeks of grinding losses, Buckner's troops finally broke through the first major Japanese defensive line, the one running through Makinato. It had cost them dearly to get there, and what waited past it was a second line, then a third, each one dug as deep as the last. The Army had a breakthrough to show for 3 weeks of fighting. The Navy still had a fleet sitting in range of Kyushu, paying for every one of those weeks in ships. Buckner was not being stubborn for its own sake. His divisions were fighting through a defense the Japanese had spent months digging into solid rock, and he had already tried to break it open all at once, on April 19th, with everything he had: artillery, naval gunfire, hundreds of aircraft, the heaviest barrage of the campaign so far. The Japanese simply went deeper underground and waited it out. Buckner believed the only way through Shuri was straight through it, at whatever pace that took and whatever it cost. There was another way to attack the problem, and it was Nimitz's own fleet admirals who wanted it badly. The 10th Army had the landing craft, and a veteran Marine division. It could still commit to put a fresh force ashore behind the Japanese line entirely, at a beach near Minatoga on the southeastern coast, and force Ushijima's army to fight in 2 directions at once. Spruance wanted it. Turner wanted it. The Marine generals pressed it hard enough that the Commandant of the Marine Corps, Alexander Vandegrift, flew out personally to make the case to Buckner's face. One of Buckner's own division commanders, fresh off pulling the same maneuver successfully behind Japanese lines at Leyte only months earlier, had been pushing for it since before his men finished the fight for Ishima. Buckner said no. It was not stubbornness. His staff warned him the beaches at Minatoga could not support the supply tonnage a second front would need. His intelligence officers reported Japanese reserves still dug in along exactly that stretch of coast, ready to meet any landing there. And Buckner had read enough about the Allied landing at Anzio the year before to know what could happen to a division put ashore behind enemy lines with nowhere to go, but the beach it landed on. What happened next surprised almost everyone watching. Nimitz came down on the same side as Buckner, overruling his own fleet admirals and the Marine generals he had commanded since Guadalcanal to do it. The 2 questions appear to have been settled around the same visit, days apart at most. Nimitz did not treat decisiveness as one setting he kept turned up at all times. On the question of whether to risk a second landing, Buckner's judgment was the one he trusted. On the question of how much longer the fleet could keep absorbing a ship and a half a day, he trusted his own. That second question is the one that had put him on the plane in the first place, not a new argument. The same one Spruance and Turner had already made by cable, delivered now by the one man in the entire Pacific theater, whose chain of command Buckner could not simply read past and set aside, said to his face, with a deadline attached. Buckner heard him out. He did not relieve a single officer on the spot. He did not change his strategy that afternoon, and he did not promise anything beyond what he had already been doing. He went back to grinding forward at Shuri, the same way he had been grinding forward since the 19th. 4 days later, on April 27th, he signed the orders. The 1st Marine Division moved south to relieve the battered 27th Infantry Division on the line. The 77th Infantry Division relieved the 96th. Not long after, the 6th Marine Division followed them south, bringing the entire 3rd Amphibious Corps onto the southern front for the first time since the landing. Nobody can draw a straight line from one admiral's sentence to one general's order 4 days later. Buckner had his own reasons, his own timetable, his own sense of when his reserves were finally ready to move, and he never said otherwise in any account he left behind. What can be said is this. The man running the entire United States Pacific Fleet did not send a strongly worded cable and wait for a reply, the way Spruance and Turner had for weeks running. He left the headquarters he had occupied for nearly 3 months. He flew to a battlefield that was not his to command, found a general from a different service entirely, and said one thing, once, to his face. With fresh divisions now on the southern line, the reinforced position held against a major Japanese counteroffensive on May 4th. Ushijima's gunners moved their artillery out into the open to support it, firing 13,000 rounds in a single push, and lost dozens of guns to American counter-battery fire for the trouble. The attack failed. Buckner launched his own renewed offensive on May 11th. By the 14th, the Marines were grinding into a fortified rise the Japanese called Sugarloaf Hill, taking it apart over the next 2 weeks with naval gunfire, field artillery, rockets, and napalm. It would take 6 more weeks of fighting like that to finish what the offensive started. Nobody on either side called it fast, but it moved. In a way the previous 3 weeks had not, and the fleet kept its station offshore the entire time. Still paying the price Nimitz had flown out to talk about. Still not going anywhere. That is not the kind of authority that comes from rank. It is the kind that comes from showing up. By the end of May 1945, Spruance had not come off that flag bridge in months. Iwo Jima in February. Then straight through the planning, the landing, and every week of kamikaze attacks at Okinawa since. His fleet carried a different name, depending on who held the flag. 5th Fleet under him. 3rd under Halsey. But the ships and the men fighting them never stopped long enough to notice the difference. Whichever name was painted on the orders that week. The staff behind it had been awake the whole time. Nimitz watched that toll add up the same way he watched everything, without comment, without panic, without looking away from it. This was not the first time he had pulled an exhausted commander out of a fight. Nearly 3 years earlier, at Guadalcanal, he had quietly relieved a man who could no longer carry the weight of that campaign. A decision made because the officer himself was starting to come apart under it. Set side by side, the 2 decisions can look like an echo of each other. They were not the same decision. Nobody questioned whether the 5th Fleet had done its job in the spring of 1945. Nobody questioned Spruance's judgment, then or since. He had not started missing things. He had not lost the confidence of the men around him. What Nimitz was looking at on May 27th was not a man failing. It was a man who had not failed at all, doing the math on how much longer that could hold, and deciding not to find out the hard way. He relieved Spruance and his entire staff in the middle of the campaign. Weeks before the fighting on Okinawa was finished, William Halsey took the fleet. Overnight. The same ships answered to a different name again, without missing a single watch. The relief did not reach the sailors standing watch on the ships themselves. They stayed exactly where they were, under whichever name the fleet carried that week, because the war did not pause for them the way it could, briefly, for the men planning it from a desk. There is a version of decisiveness that only ever looks forward. More pressure, more speed, more demands on the men ahead of you. Nimitz had that version. He had used it a month earlier, standing in front of Buckner. Okinawa is also where he showed the other version, the one where the hardest call is not pushing harder. It is pulling your best people back before they have given you any reason to, because you can see further down the road than they can from where they are standing. Okinawa fell on June 22nd, 82 days after the landing, roughly on the timeline the Navy needed it to fall. The line at Shuri did not break from one decision or one sentence. It broke because divisions kept moving onto it, because carriers kept launching off Mitcher's decks, because picket ships kept standing their watch, until there was nowhere left for that line to hold. Yamato sits on the bottom of the East China Sea, the way she has since the afternoon of April 7th. The fleet that earned its nickname that spring never once pulled back from the water off that island. Not for a single day. Until the island was finally secured, a ship and a half a day was never a statistic to the man who said it. It was a radar picket line standing watch every morning before dawn, not knowing whether today was the day. It was a gun crew that lost count of how many planes they had shot down, somewhere past the 20th. It was a young man, maybe 19, maybe 20, who never came home to tell anyone what that morning sounded like, and a young man right beside him who did come home, and never quite found the words either. Most of those men are gone now. The ones who are left are in their late 90s, if they are anywhere at all. What they carried out of that water off Okinawa, most of them carried quietly, for the rest of their lives, without ever once describing it the way it actually happened. Some mornings a man simply decides are not for telling, and keeps that decision for 60 or 70 years. That is usually where these stories end, in silence, in a kitchen somewhere, never spoken out loud by the only people who were actually there. If somebody in your family stood watch on a ship in the Pacific, a destroyer, a carrier, a submarine, anything that floated and fought, tell us which one, if you still know its name. Tell us his job aboard it, too, if you remember it. Loader, lookout, engine room. Whatever he did down there kept that ship in the fight one more day than it might have lasted without him. Put it in the comments. Let the name of his ship outlive the war it fought in.
December 25th, 1943. Late evening, Altafjord, northern Norway. The fjord lay under heavy winter silence. Snow covered the slopes that rose sharply from the water. The surface of the harbor was dark, broken only by the faint movement of anchored warships. At anchor beneath those mountains lay the German battleship Scharnhorst. Her decks were coated with ice. Sailors moved carefully along frozen steel, checking lines, securing equipment, clearing snow from exposed fittings. Anti-aircraft guns stood ready. Ammunition was already moved closer to hoists. Action stations had been assigned. Shortly after 1900 hours, smoke began rising from her funnels. Deep within the hull, turbines turned slowly at first. Boilers were brought up to pressure. The vibration carried upward through the structure of the ship. Orders from German Naval Command were clear. Intercept Allied convoy JW-55B. That convoy was moving toward the Soviet Union through Arctic waters. It carried vehicles, fuel, munitions, and industrial supplies. Each convoy that reached Murmansk strengthened Soviet resistance on the Eastern Front. Berlin believed the convoy's escort was limited. The opportunity appeared favorable. Rear Admiral Erich Bay stood on the bridge wing as Scharnhorst prepared to weigh anchor. Wind gusts cut sharply across the fjord. Temperatures were below freezing. He had assumed command of the battleship only months earlier. He understood that Germany's heavy surface fleet had few remaining operational units. Scharnhorst was one of the last capital ships capable of offensive action in northern waters. Turning back without engagement was not expected. By 1930 hours, lines were cast off. Slowly, the battleship moved forward through the narrow fjord channel. Searchlights remained dark. Only dim navigation lights were used. Behind her, 5 German destroyers followed in formation. Their bows rose and fell sharply in the winter swell. Once clear of the fjord, Scharnhorst increased speed. The North Cape region in December is not forgiving. Darkness dominates most of the day. What passes for daylight is often a pale gray twilight. Snow squalls move quickly and without warning. Maintaining formation in such conditions required constant helm correction. Destroyers struggled to keep steady position astern as seas built. But speed remained the German advantage. By midnight, Scharnhorst was making over 25 knots, gradually increasing as sea conditions allowed. Her long hull cut through the cold water with steady force. Her mission depended on surprise. Morning came slowly on December 26th. There was no clear sunrise. Instead, a dull band of light spread across the horizon. The sea and sky blended together in muted gray. At approximately 8:40 hours, British cruiser forces screening convoy JW-55B were already maneuvering in defensive positions. HMS Belfast, HMS Norfolk, and HMS Sheffield formed the outer protective layer. Their radar operators had been scanning continuously throughout the night. At 900 hours, a radar contact appeared. Large, fast, closing, range approximately 22,000 yards. There was still no visual confirmation. Snow and low light obscured the horizon, but the radar return was strong. British cruisers altered course to intercept. Range began to close. Star shells were prepared. At 9:29 hours, the first star shell burst overhead. For several seconds, the Arctic sky turned bright white. The reflection off snow and sea was harsh and sudden. Against that glare, the outline of Scharnhorst became visible. British cruisers opened fire almost immediately. 8-inch shells arced upward and disappeared into the gray sky before descending toward their target. Water columns erupted around the German battleship. Splashes rose higher than her deck. Fragments rattled across steel plating. Inside Scharnhorst's forward superstructure, a British shell burst nearby. Fragmentation damage struck exposed equipment. Reports from the radar compartment indicated intermittent malfunction of the forward radar antenna. The damage was not catastrophic, but it reduced clarity. Range estimates became less certain. Admiral Bay now faced a decision: continue toward the expected convoy route, or disengage temporarily and reassess the tactical situation. He had encountered cruisers, not a battleship. His ship was faster than most British heavy units. At approximately 9:45 hours, Scharnhorst turned south at high speed. Her wake widened across the sea as engines pushed harder. British cruisers attempted to maintain contact. Snow squalls repeatedly interrupted visual observation, but radar tracking continued. For several hours, contact shifted in phases. Sight gained, sight lost, course changes by both sides. Seas grew rougher. German destroyers struggled to maintain close escort position in worsening swell. Separation distances gradually increased. Coordination became more difficult. To the south, another British force was already maneuvering. The battleship HMS Duke of York, under Admiral Bruce Fraser, was moving into position. She was supported by cruisers and destroyers, forming a second layer of interception. Radar reports from the northern cruiser force were relayed southward. By mid-afternoon, a convergence was forming in Arctic waters. At 16:32 hours, radar contact was confirmed between Duke of York and Scharnhorst. Range was decreasing steadily. Both ships maneuvered deliberately, adjusting bearing and speed. Snow continued to drift across the sea in irregular bands. At 16:47 hours, Duke of York fired her first full broadside. 10 14-inch guns discharged nearly simultaneously. The concussion rolled outward across the dark water. Flashes briefly illuminated falling snow. The first salvo fell short. Corrections were applied. The second straddled. Within minutes, a heavy shell penetrated near Scharnhorst's boiler room. Inside the engine spaces, pressure readings fluctuated. Speed dropped below 28 knots. Not fatal, but measurable. And in Arctic waters, measurable loss of speed mattered. The engagement had entered a new phase. When Duke of York and Scharnhorst finally closed to heavy gun distance, the character of the battle changed. This was no longer a question of detection. It became a matter of geometry. At ranges between 11,000 and 13,000 yards, battleship gunnery is a precise calculation. Ships do not simply point and fire. They must estimate bearing, relative speed, roll, pitch, wind, and the curvature of the Earth. Each salvo is a solution to a moving equation. Both ships were maneuvering continuously. That complicates everything. For Admiral Fraser aboard Duke of York, the objective was clear: reduce German speed further and hold contact long enough for destroyers to intervene. For Admiral Bay, the objective was different: maintain enough maneuvering freedom to prevent encirclement. Speed, therefore, was not simply a statistic, it was geometry. The faster ship controls separation distance, the slower ship becomes predictable. Heavy guns fired in patterns. When Duke of York discharged a full broadside, 10 shells left the barrels in staggered microseconds. They would land in an elongated pattern across the water. If the pattern straddled the target, meaning splashes landed both ahead and behind, gunnery officers knew they were close. From there, corrections were minimal. German gunnery teams followed similar procedure. Despite earlier damage, Scharnhorst's main batteries continued firing in coordinated sequences. Observers on British ships reported near misses that threw water high across their forecastles. Even a near miss from an 11-inch shell can send shock through hull plating. Steel flexes, equipment shifts, crew feel the concussion. At that range, survival depends on consistency, not luck. Inside Scharnhorst, the impact of cumulative hits began to change internal rhythm. Bulkheads designed to resist flooding were holding, but under strain. Damage control teams worked systematically. Pumps activated, compartments isolated, counter-flooding calculated. None of these measures are dramatic. They are procedural. But procedure is what keeps a battleship alive after impact. Meanwhile, maneuvering space narrowed. The Arctic coastline to the south limited wide evasive arcs. To the north were British cruisers. To the east and west, destroyers were beginning to position. Admiral Bay had to choose his heading carefully. A sharp turn might disrupt British firing solutions, but it also risks exposing broadside to torpedo attack. Maintaining course preserves speed, but makes trajectory predictable. These are not theoretical dilemmas. They unfold minute by minute. By late afternoon, British destroyers were calculating approach vectors. Torpedoes require geometry as well. A destroyer must predict where the enemy will be, not where it is. In heavy seas, a mistimed launch wastes weapons. Inaccurate approach exposes the destroyer to main gun fire. This is why destroyers waited. They were not hesitant. They were aligning angles. As Scharnhorst's speed gradually decreased, her turning radius widened. That is physics. A slower vessel responds more slowly to helm orders. The difference between 30 knots and 20 knots is not merely 10 knots. It is the difference between sharp evasive maneuver and gradual arc. British gunnery officers recognized that shift. Reports from plotting rooms reflected increasing confidence in target prediction. On Duke of York, Admiral Fraser did not rush the encounter. He maintained spacing. Closing too quickly risked exposure to German fire. Holding optimal range preserved British advantage. This was not a reckless charge. It was controlled pressure. Within Scharnhorst, command discipline remained intact. Admiral Bay did not abandon aggressive maneuvering, but each maneuver required fuel, speed, and structural resilience. With cumulative damage increasing, flexibility decreased. The ship was still fighting, but the margin for error was shrinking. By early evening, the tactical picture had become asymmetrical. British forces operated as a layered formation. Cruisers maintained peripheral pressure. The battleship delivered heavy-caliber fire. Destroyers maneuvered for torpedo opportunities. Scharnhorst, separated from her destroyers in worsening seas, was effectively operating alone. A single battleship can be formidable, but alone it must divide attention between gunnery, maneuver, and defense. Layered fleets distribute those tasks. As gunfire continued, internal reports aboard the German ship became more frequent. Localized flooding, power fluctuations, ammunition handling under strain. None individually decisive, but cumulative. Naval battles often hinge not on the first impact, but on the 10th. By the time destroyers began coordinated torpedo runs, the engagement was already structurally tilted. The British did not need a dramatic breakthrough. They needed consistency. Consistent fire, consistent tracking, consistent pressure. At sea, under Arctic conditions, consistency defeats brilliance. By early evening on December 26th, the battle was no longer defined by gun flashes. It was defined by internal pressure. Inside Scharnhorst, the rhythm of the ship had changed. A battleship underway has a steady pulse. Engines turning at constant revolutions, vibration running evenly through steel frames. Crew learn that rhythm. They move with it. Now that rhythm was uneven. Propulsion output had fallen in stages, steam pressure fluctuated. Reports from engineering compartments were no longer routine. They were corrective. Below the waterline, the effects of torpedo detonations were not visible from the deck, but they were immediate inside. A torpedo does not simply puncture steel. It creates a shock wave that travels through water, slams against the hull, and forces structure inward before rebounding outward. Frames bend, rivets shear, pipes rupture. Compartments begin taking water, not only through visible breaches, but through weakened seams. Damage control teams moved through narrow passageways under dim emergency lighting. Some main circuits had failed. Portable lamps were brought in. Communication relied increasingly on runners when wiring faltered. Water levels were measured continuously. Counter-flooding orders were calculated to offset list. Counter-flooding is a calculated sacrifice. You deliberately allow water into selected compartments to balance the ship. But it consumes reserve buoyancy. Each decision trades stability for time. As additional hits accumulated, reserve buoyancy decreased. Reports began noting that lower compartments were filling faster than pumps could compensate. Pumps are powerful, but they depend on power supply. When electrical distribution becomes unstable, pumping efficiency drops. At that stage, engineers face a narrowing equation. Maintain propulsion or maintain drainage. Doing both becomes increasingly difficult. On deck, crew may still see guns firing. Below deck, men see something different. They see gauges dropping, bulkheads vibrating, water creeping across metal flooring. Heat in boiler rooms remained intense. The contrast between freezing exterior air and superheated interior spaces was extreme. Steam leaks created fog within compartments. Visibility was limited even before lights dimmed, yet procedure continued. Doors were sealed, hatches secured. Reports relayed upward. As speed fell further, the ship's response to helm commands slowed. Inside, that change is felt before it is announced. Engine revolutions drop. The vibration underfoot lessens. The familiar forward thrust weakens. Officers on the bridge receive speed reports in numbers. Men below feel it in motion. By the time speed approached 10 knots, the difference was unmistakable. A battleship at 10 knots in open water is no longer maneuvering aggressively. She is surviving, and survival depends on structural integrity. The cumulative effect of repeated torpedo impacts began to affect longitudinal strength. Warships are built with internal framing designed to distribute stress across the hull. But when multiple sections are weakened, stress redistributes unevenly. This is when list begins to increase. At first, slight, then measurable. Attempts were made to correct it. Counter-flooding continued, but the list returned and increased. Electrical instability compounded the problem. Some turret circuits became unreliable. Fire control communication lines degraded. Main guns that had fired in steady rhythm earlier now fired at irregular intervals. A battleship's strength lies not only in gun size, but in coordination. As coordination falters, effectiveness declines. Admiral Bay remained on the bridge. He did not have full visibility of internal conditions. No commander does in such moments. Reports came in fragments: flooding in one section, power fluctuation in another, damage to communications elsewhere. Command decisions became reactive rather than proactive. Maintain heading, adjust speed, attempt stabilization. But each new report reduced available options. When additional torpedoes struck along the port side, the internal balance shifted decisively. The list increased beyond what counter-flooding could correct. At a certain angle, gravity accelerates flooding. Water moves toward the lowest side of the hull. Bulkheads designed for vertical pressure now absorb lateral strain. Doors that were sealed become submerged. Once flooding crosses compartment boundaries unchecked, recovery becomes unlikely. Inside lower compartments, men faced rising water in darkness. Orders to abandon certain spaces were given when remaining would mean entrapment. Damage control in such conditions is not dramatic. It is procedural until the moment procedure no longer works. As the list deepened, movement across decks became hazardous. Loose equipment slid. Oil mixed with water across flooring. Men braced against bulkheads to maintain footing. Above, the superstructure may still have appeared intact in silhouette. Below, structural survival was ending. At approximately 1945 hours, the list increased sharply. When a large warship reaches critical angle, righting moment disappears. There is a threshold beyond which recovery is mathematically impossible. Scharnhorst crossed that threshold. Internal compartments flooded rapidly. Air trapped within upper spaces escaped in bursts as the ship rolled. From inside, the sensation would not have been cinematic. It would have been sudden imbalance. Metal groaning under stress. Water rising faster than before. Then darkness. The final minutes of Scharnhorst were not decided by a single shell or a single torpedo. They were decided by cumulative structural failure. A warship can endure damage. It cannot endure unlimited damage. Once buoyancy, propulsion, and internal cohesion degrade together, collapse becomes inevitable. When Scharnhorst disappeared beneath the Arctic surface at 1945 hours, the noise did not end immediately. Explosions had ceased. Gunfire stopped. But the sea was not silent. Oil spread across the water in dark, widening sheets. Broken timbers, debris, and fragments of equipment drifted between the swells. In the distance, British ships slowed carefully, maintaining formation while scanning the surface. Voices were heard. In Arctic water, survival is measured in minutes. The temperature was close to freezing. Men thrown into the sea without adequate flotation would lose strength rapidly. British destroyers launched small rescue efforts, but commanders were cautious. Submarine threat remained a possibility. Remaining stationary in those waters carried risk. 36 German sailors were recovered alive. Nearly 2,000 had sailed from Altafjord the night before. Most did not return. For the Royal Navy, the operation was a success in operational terms. Convoy JW-55B continued its journey to the Soviet Union. Supplies arrived. Arctic convoy routes remained open. But for those who witnessed the final moments, what stayed in memory was not logistics. It was the image of a large warship rolling slowly, stern lifting briefly against a gray horizon before vanishing. Naval warfare often ends not with spectacle, but with disappearance. In Germany, confirmation of the loss came through delayed reports. Scharnhorst had been one of the few remaining capital ships capable of offensive surface operations in northern waters. With her gone, Germany's ability to challenge Arctic convoys with heavy surface units was effectively over. Heavy ships still existed on paper, but paper does not project force. By 1944, Allied air power in the region was expanding steadily. Anchored battleships were no longer secure. Norwegian fjords that once provided shelter had become targets. Even survival in port was uncertain. It is difficult not to wonder whether the outcome could have been different. Earlier that morning, when British cruisers first made contact, Scharnhorst still possessed full speed and maneuvering freedom. Admiral Bay chose to disengage temporarily, then continued south in search of opportunity. Had he chosen instead to break off entirely and return to Altafjord at that first encounter, the ship might well have survived December 26th. She could have re-entered the fjord before British battleship forces closed the distance, but survival that day would not have restored strategic balance. Each subsequent convoy would have required similar risk, and each month brought stronger Allied coordination and greater air presence. Returning safely once would not have changed the narrowing margin. It would only have delayed confrontation. There was another moment, later in the afternoon, that invites reflection. During the gunnery exchange with Duke of York, several German salvos landed close enough to throw heavy water over British decks. British radar experienced temporary interference. Fire control adjustments were required under pressure. Had one 11-inch shell struck decisively, disabling British fire control or reducing propulsion, the engagement might have shifted. A prolonged night action in Arctic darkness introduces uncertainty. Confusion increases. Targeting becomes more difficult. Separation distance can open unexpectedly. Under those conditions, a faster German ship might have slipped contact. It is not impossible. But it is equally true that British destroyers were already maneuvering into torpedo positions from multiple bearings. Numerical advantage remained decisive. A single heavy hit might have extended the battle. It would not necessarily have reversed it. What stands out in retrospect is not a single catastrophic error. There was no reckless charge, no dramatic miscalculation. Instead, there was accumulation, reduced speed, restricted maneuver space, increasing structural damage, layered opposition. Naval battles are often decided less by brilliance than by sustained pressure. Once mobility declined and encirclement formed, recovery became improbable. Today, the wreck of Scharnhorst lies more than 900 feet below the Arctic surface. Her hull is broken into sections. Main turrets remain largely intact. The steel structure that once carried nearly 2,000 men now rests in silence. Steel survives longer than command decisions, but even steel does not survive indefinitely. For those who study the Second World War at sea, the sinking of Scharnhorst marks more than the loss of a single battleship. It marks the end of Germany's attempt to use surface raiders as decisive instruments in the Arctic. From that point forward, control of northern sea routes belonged firmly to coordinated fleets supported by radar, air power, and layered defense. For those who remember the war years, the lesson is simpler. A warship may possess speed, armor, and firepower, but once room to maneuver disappears, those strengths diminish rapidly. On the night of December 26, 1943, in freezing Arctic waters, maneuvering space narrowed until none remained. And when that space was gone, so was Scharnhorst. In 1939, a remarkable film captured one of the most powerful warships the world had ever seen, the HMS Hood, Britain's greatest warship of World War II. Launched back in 1918, over 860 feet of pure power. She was sleek. She was fast. 30 knots when she wanted to be. And those 8 15-inch guns? They spoke with authority that the whole world understood. For 20 years, she was the pride of the Royal Navy. She sailed around the globe, welcomed 700,000 visitors, showed everyone that Britannia still ruled the waves. But then, on a cold May morning in 1941, everything changed. Out there in the Denmark Strait, 300 miles west of Iceland, the Hood met her match, the brand-new German battleship Bismarck. At 5:52 in the morning, the guns roared. 90 seconds later, a single shell from Bismarck found its mark. Just 3 minutes after that, the mighty Hood was gone, blown apart in one terrible explosion. 1,415 fine young men lost. Only 3 survived. The largest loss of life ever suffered by a British warship. Now, for 71 long years, good people argued about what really happened that day. 2 official boards of inquiry tried their best, but they never got to the bottom of it. A lot of fine historians and a lot of old sailors laid the blame right at the feet of Admiral Lancelot Holland. They said he made a fatal mistake, that he turned the ship too early or too late, that he didn't bring her broadside to bear the way he should have, that he left the Hood vulnerable when she should have been fighting with everything she had. And for 71 years, that cloud of blame hung over his name. But here is what changed everything. In 2012, a team of explorers sailed back to that lonely stretch of the North Atlantic aboard a magnificent research yacht called the Octopus. They had with them one of the world's best deep-sea men, David Mearns, the same man who first found the wreck in 2001. Naval archaeologist Ennis McCartney was there, and so was Rear Admiral Philip Wilcox, whose own Uncle Eric had been a 20-year-old sailor on the Hood that day. They lowered their remotely operated vehicle 2 miles down into the cold, dark water. And what they brought back changed the story forever. It wasn't a big dramatic discovery. It was something small, something quiet. It was the rudder, that single piece of steel, still sitting exactly where it had been when the ship hit the bottom, still turned at the proper angle, still pristine after 71 years on the seabed. That rudder had been waiting down there all this time, quietly holding the truth. And today, we're going to let it speak. We're going to show you exactly what it proved and how it finally silenced 71 years of blame. To really understand why that rudder would one day matter so much, we need to step back a little and meet the 2 ships themselves and feel the desperate situation that brought them face to face in those freezing waters. Let's begin with the Hood. She was born in a different time. Launched in 1918, right at the very end of the First World War, they built her on a scale that still took your breath away. 860 feet of graceful steel, a long, sleek hull designed to slice through the ocean like a knife. 4 enormous turbines gave her a top speed of 30 knots, fast enough to run down almost anything afloat in her day. Her main guns, 8 15-inch rifles and 4 twin turrets, could reach out and hit a target 14 miles away with shells that weighed nearly a ton each. But here's the important part most folks forget. The Hood was built as a battle cruiser. Not a true battleship. That meant she traded some armor for speed. Her decks and sides were strong enough for the threats of 1918, but by the late 1930s, the world had moved on. Newer ships were being laid down with much thicker protection. Still, to the Royal Navy and to the British people, the Hood remained the queen of the fleet. She was the very picture of imperial power. Now turn your eyes to the other side of the North Sea. Germany had spent years in secret, building something brand new, something meant to challenge everything the Hood stood for. They called her Bismarck. Laid down in 1936, launched in 1939, completed and ready for sea in the spring of 1941, she was a full battleship from the keel up, heavier armor, more modern fire control systems, guns every bit as powerful as the Hood's, and some said even more accurate. On the 19th of May, 1941, the Bismarck slipped quietly out of Gotenhafen in occupied Poland. With her was the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen. Their mission was simple and deadly. Slip into the North Atlantic, find the slow-moving convoys carrying food, fuel, and weapons to a beleaguered Britain, and sink as many merchant ships as possible. The British knew the danger. They had been fighting the convoy war for 2 long years. Every month, thousands of tons of shipping went down. If the Germans could cut that lifeline, Britain would starve. So the Admiralty acted fast. They sent out every available warship that could reach the Denmark Strait, that narrow, icy passage between Iceland and Greenland, where the German raiders would most likely try to break out. Leading the intercept force was HMS Hood, now 23 years old, accompanied by the new battleship Prince of Wales. In overall command was Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland, a quiet, experienced officer who had spent his whole life studying exactly this kind of fight. By the evening of May 23rd, the 2 British ships were racing north at full speed. They knew the Bismarck was somewhere close, but thick fog had swallowed her up. Holland had to make his decisions in the dark. He chose his course carefully. He positioned the Hood and Prince of Wales to block the most likely breakout route, and he gave one standing order that would become the center of so much argument later. When contact was made, he would not charge straight in with all guns blazing right away. Instead, he planned a classic Royal Navy maneuver. First, close the range head-on at high speed, presenting the smallest possible target to the enemy. Then, at the last safe moment, begin a series of 20-degree turns to port, one after another. Each turn would swing the Hood's broadside around, bringing her rear turrets into the fight, until she could pour full salvos from all 8 guns at once. It was textbook. It was the way every British admiral had been trained for decades. But it took time, about 30 seconds to complete the turn at 28 knots. At 5:35 on the morning of May 24th, the fog suddenly lifted. Lookouts on the Prince of Wales spotted the Bismarck and Prinz Eugen 14 miles away on the horizon. Holland gave the order to open fire. The guns of the Hood roared first. 90 seconds later, the Bismarck answered. Shells began falling around the British ships, tall columns of white water rising into the gray dawn. Holland held his course just a little longer, waiting for the perfect moment to begin that turn. The range was closing fast. The guns were speaking, and somewhere in the next few minutes, Admiral Holland would have to decide exactly when to swing those 20 degrees to port. That decision, and the exact position of the rudder when the fatal moment came, would be argued about for the next 71 years. But, for now, the 2 greatest warships of their time were locked in a fight to the death, in one of the coldest, loneliest stretches of ocean on Earth. The battle itself lasted only minutes, but the questions it left behind lasted 71 years. Within 3 minutes of that first hit, the Hood was simply gone. A single, enormous fireball rose into the gray Arctic sky. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but wreckage and oil on the water. On board the Prince of Wales, Men watched in stunned silence. They had seen their flagship vanish in a way no one had ever imagined. A few of them later drew rough sketches on scraps of paper, trying to explain to the Admiralty exactly what they had witnessed. One sketch showed a tall column of flame shooting straight up from somewhere near the mainmast. Another described two separate balls of fire, one higher than the other. A third man remembered one great big flash and a lot of smoke. And then, nothing. Back in London, the Admiralty was shaken to its core. This was not just the loss of a ship. This was the loss of the very symbol of British sea power. If the Hood could be destroyed so quickly, what did that say about every other British warship still fighting the war? So they did what governments do in times like that. They appointed not one, but two separate boards of inquiry. The first met within weeks. The second followed a few months later, when more reports came in. The officers who sat on those boards were serious men, experienced admirals and engineers. They read every survivor's statement. They studied the sketches. They examined fragments of wreckage that had drifted ashore weeks later. They even interviewed Ted Briggs, one of the three men who had somehow lived through the explosion. But here is what they quickly discovered. The evidence simply did not add up. Some witnesses swore the fatal shell had struck near the forward turrets. Others were certain it had hit somewhere aft, near the captain's quarters. A few insisted the explosion had started in the torpedo tubes. Still others believed it had begun in one of the 4-inch anti-aircraft magazines. The boards tried every possible theory. They calculated shell trajectories. They studied the armor plating on the Hood's decks. They ran test after test on how cordite and shells behaved under extreme heat. And, in the end, both boards came to the same frustrating conclusion. They wrote it plainly in their final reports. Many points in connection with the loss of the Hood can never be proved definitely without access to the wreck. Without the ship herself lying there on the bottom, they simply could not say for certain where the shell had struck or why the explosion had been so complete. So the official record stayed open-ended, but that did not stop the arguments. In the years that followed, historians and old naval officers began to pick apart Admiral Holland's decisions in those final minutes. The sharpest criticism came from men like Captain Stephen Roskill, the Royal Navy's own official historian after the war. Roskill and others pointed to one moment in particular. They said Holland had begun his turn to port too early, that by swinging the ship when he did, he had allowed the Bismarck to cross the T, a classic naval nightmare where the enemy can fire all its guns while you can only use your forward ones. Other voices claimed Holland had actually turned too late. They argued he should have ordered the turn a full 30 seconds sooner, that those few extra seconds might have brought the Hood's rear turrets to bear before the fatal shell arrived. Still others blamed the weather, the fog, the speed of the ships, even the fact that the Prince of Wales was still so new that some of her guns were having mechanical trouble. The debate spilled out of official circles and into books, magazines, and eventually the internet. Old sailors argued about it in veterans' halls. Model builders argued about it on hobby forums. Documentaries replayed the same grainy footage over and over, each one offering a different theory. For 71 years, the question hung in the air like North Atlantic fog. Did Admiral Lancelot Holland get it wrong? Did one man's split-second decision cost the lives of 1,415 young sailors? Some said yes, and they said it with real anger. They believed Holland's hesitation or haste had left the Hood broadside to the enemy at exactly the wrong moment. They felt the Royal Navy had let its own men down. Others defended him fiercely. They said he had followed the textbook to the letter, that no commander could have done better against a brand-new battleship in those conditions. They called the criticism unfair, almost disrespectful to a man who had died with his ship, and all the while, the wreck of the Hood lay 2 miles down in the cold darkness, holding the only evidence that could ever settle the argument. No one on those boards of inquiry, no historian writing in the 1950s, or 1960s. No veteran still arguing at the bar in 1990 could possibly have imagined that one day a small, silent piece of steel would finally speak the truth. But it was there, waiting. And in 2012, it finally got its chance to be heard. And so, in the summer of 2012, a very different kind of ship arrived in those same treacherous waters. Not a warship this time. A sleek, modern research yacht named the Octopus. On board were three men who carried the story in their bones. David Mearns, the Australian deep-sea explorer who had first located the Hood's wreck back in 2001. Naval archaeologist Ennis McCartney, a man who had built model kits of the Hood as a boy and never stopped wondering about her. And Rear Admiral Philip Wilcox of the Royal Navy, whose Uncle Eric had been a 20-year-old able seaman on the Hood's 4-inch guns the day she disappeared. They had come for one reason only: to let the ship herself tell the truth. The Octopus dropped anchor 300 miles west of Iceland, right over the spot David had kept secret for more than a decade. The Denmark Strait was living up to its reputation. Cold, gray, and restless. But the weather window was narrow, so they wasted no time. Down went the remotely operated vehicle, the ROV, a bright yellow machine the size of a small car, packed with cameras, lights, and robotic arms. It took 2 full hours to sink through 2 miles of black water before it finally touched the bottom at 2,800 meters. What the team saw on their monitors was almost heartbreaking. The once mighty Hood was no longer one ship. She had been torn into pieces that now lay scattered across more than 2 miles of seafloor. The main wreckage had settled into 2 distinct fields, roughly 600 meters apart. David studied the sonar chart and spoke quietly. She was still doing 28 knots when she broke up. That distance tells you how violent the explosion really was. The ROV picked its way carefully through the debris. Strong currents kept trying to push it sideways. At one point, the operator had to yank it upward fast just to keep it from colliding with a jagged section of hull. But the cameras kept rolling. And little by little, the ship began to reveal herself. Shoes lying on the silt, a gas mask still in its canvas bag, a ship's bell that had once hung outside the captain's quarters, now half buried and impossible to free. Every small object reminded the men that this was not just steel. This was a grave. Then, as the ROV crept along the edge of the larger debris field, Ennis McCartney suddenly leaned forward in his chair. Wait. Look there. The camera panned across a massive, curved structure lying flat on the seabed. 6 meters tall, still perfectly formed. The port rudder. The team held their breath. Because this was no ordinary piece of wreckage. This was the very control surface that had steered the Hood in her final 30 seconds of life. The rudder was pristine, not bent, not crumpled, not scarred by any impact with the bottom. The steel still showed its original smooth curves. The massive worm gear mechanism that locked it in position was clearly visible and undamaged. And, most important of all, it was turned, not straight ahead, not hard over, but angled at approximately 20 degrees to port. Exactly the position it would have been in if the ship had begun her planned series of turns and was halfway through the maneuver when the fatal shell struck. David Mearns spoke first, his voice low with wonder. Look at that. Nice and pristine all the way. No damage from the seabed at all. Ennis McCartney, the naval archaeologist, began to explain what they were actually seeing. You see, the rudder doesn't just swing free like a door. Once the helmsman moves the wheel, powerful hydraulic motors turn the rudder and the worm gear locks it in place. It stays there, even after the ship is gone. This one never moved again after that morning in 1941. He paused, letting the image fill the screen. If Admiral Holland had never given the order to turn, the rudder would be dead ahead, straight as an arrow. If the ship had been hit before any turn began, same thing. But 20 degrees to port? That is the exact angle you get when you have started the classic Royal Navy maneuver. Head-on approach, then successive 20-degree turns to bring the after turrets to bear. The team ran the numbers again and again. At 28 knots, each 20-degree turn took roughly 10 seconds. 3 turns would have given the hood her full broadside. This rudder had completed one, and was well into the second, when the explosion tore the ship apart. In other words, Admiral Lancelot Holland had given the order. Captain Ralph Kerr had executed it. The helmsman had turned the wheel. The great ship had begun to swing exactly as the textbook demanded. And the rudder, lying there in the cold silt after 71 years, had kept the record straight. But the story the rudder told went even deeper, because its angle also told the team exactly where the hood was pointing at the moment the shell arrived. That heading placed the fatal impact right at the weakest point in her armor, the lightly plated deck just forward of the mainmast. The shell had punched through that thin steel, traveled downward, and detonated inside the after 15-inch magazine. The ROV moved on, following the debris trail, and what it found next confirmed everything. Hundreds of brass Clarkson cases, the containers that held the cordite charges for the big guns, lay scattered and ruptured across the seabed. Every single one had been blasted open from the inside. This was not a torpedo hit. This was not an anti-aircraft magazine. This was the main 15-inch magazine, exploding. Then the camera swung over to a crumpled section of deck that had once been the captain's day room. The lino flooring was still there, hanging upside down like strange brown curtains. The entire cabin had been flipped inside out by the force coming up from directly below. All of it matched the rudder's story perfectly. The ship had been turning to port. The shell had struck at that precise moment, and the magazine directly under the captain's quarters had gone up in one catastrophic flash. Ennis McCartney summed it up for the record. We've been able to confirm that is the case. Holland had not just ordered that turn. He had actually executed it, and was probably halfway through it when she was finally hit. Rear Admiral Philip Wilcox sat quietly in the operations room, watching the images of his uncle's ship. He later said the sight of that rudder moved him more than he could express. It was as if the ship herself had waited all those decades, guarding one man's reputation, because for 71 years people had blamed Admiral Holland. They had said he was too slow, too hesitant, that he had cost 1,415 lives with one bad decision. Now, the rudder, silent, rust-covered, but perfectly honest, had spoken the final word. He had done it right. He had followed the training of a lifetime. He had begun the turn at the exact moment the book said he should. And, still, one German shell, fired from 14 miles away on a misty Arctic morning, had found the one vulnerable spot at the one vulnerable second. That is what the rudder proved. Not that the hood was invincible, not that war is fair, only that a good man had done his duty, and the sea had kept the proof until we were ready to listen. The Octopus stayed on site as long as the weather allowed. They mapped every major piece of wreckage. They photographed the rudder from every angle. They brought back hours of high-definition video that no one had ever seen before. And when they finally turned for home, they carried something more valuable than any artifact. They carried the truth, a truth that had been waiting 2 miles down, locked in 6 meters of steel, for 71 long years. So what does it all mean? After 71 years, the rudder didn't just clear one man's name. It gave us something bigger, something the world had been waiting to understand. It showed us that the hood was not lost because British shipbuilding was suddenly faulty. It was not lost because Admiral Holland had somehow failed his country. It was lost because war is never fair. And sometimes a single shell, fired from 14 miles away on a gray Arctic morning, finds the one impossible spot at the one impossible second. That is the hard truth the sea finally handed back to us. And once we accepted that truth, everything else fell into place. The age of the great battle cruisers, those floating cathedrals of steel and guns, was already ending. The Hood and the Bismarck were among the last of their kind. Within months, aircraft carriers and long-range bombers would change the rules forever. No ship, no matter how big or how fast, could hide from the sky anymore. The future belonged to smaller, smarter vessels, and to the men who flew above them. The Bismarck herself proved the point just 3 days later. Hunted down by the entire British fleet, her rudder crippled by a lucky torpedo from an old biplane, she was pounded into silence and sent to the bottom with more than 2,000 of her own crew. 2 giants gone in less than a week. A chapter in naval warfare closed for good. But on the Octopus in 2012, the men who had come to listen to the wreck were thinking about something much more personal. Rear Admiral Philip Wilcox stood on the deck one evening, looking out over the same cold water that had taken his uncle. Eric Wilcox had been 20 years old, barely more than a boy, manning one of the 4-inch guns when the explosion came. Philip had grown up hearing the story from his father. The knock at the door, the telegram that changed their family forever. I remember my father telling me the shock my grandmother had when she received that telegram, he said quietly. That boy never came home. And for decades we never really knew why. Now he knew. The rudder had told him. The ship had told him. And in that moment, something heavy lifted. David Mearns and Ennis McCartney felt it too. They had come as scientists and historians. They left as men who had helped settle an old debt. The wreck had given them more than data. It had given them a chance to speak for 1,415 voices that had been silent since 1941. Before the Octopus turned for home, the team gathered on the stern. The weather had turned rough again. The sea reminding them who was still in charge. But they had one last duty to perform. They held a simple memorial service right there on the open deck. A Royal Navy chaplain read from the old prayer book, Lord Almighty God, who rules over all our lives, accept these souls today as every man. One by one, the team stepped forward. They laid wreaths of white flowers on the water, small circles of green and white that bobbed for a moment before the waves took them. Each wreath carried a name. Each name carried a story. Each story now finally at rest. They remembered the youngest, the 16-year-old boy who had lied about his age just to serve. They remembered the fathers, the brothers, the sons who had left sweethearts behind in Portsmouth and Plymouth. They remembered Ted Briggs and the 2 other survivors who had carried the memory for the rest of their lives. And they remembered Admiral Lancelot Holland, a good man who had done everything the book and his conscience told him to do. The wreaths drifted away into the gray. The chaplain closed the book. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the wind and the sea. David Mearns later said it best. We came out here to do a lot of technical things. But most importantly, we came to honor the memory of the men. And in doing that, we have finally laid the Hood's ghosts to rest. That is what the rudder gave us. Not just the answer to a 71-year-old argument. Not just a cleared name in the history books. It gave us peace. It reminded us that even the deepest ocean, even after all those years, can still deliver justice. It reminded us that the men who went down with their ship were never forgotten. And it reminded us that sometimes the smallest, quietest piece of steel, a rudder turned 20 degrees to port, can speak louder than all the guns that ever fired. So, the next time you see a picture of the Hood, the next time you read about that cold morning in the Denmark Strait, remember the rudder. It is still down there, still holding its position, still standing guard. And now, at long last, The story is whole. Thank you for sailing with us through this journey. May we never forget the men who gave everything, so that the rest of us could live in freedom. The first light of March 1st, 1942, crept across the Java Sea, illuminating waters that had become a graveyard for Allied naval power. Through the morning haze steamed HMS Exeter, a heavy cruiser of the Royal Navy, her hull blackened by fire, her superstructure scarred by battle damage, smoke trailing from ruptured compartments. This proud warship, which had once humbled the mighty German pocket battleship Graf Spee in the legendary Battle of the River Plate 3 years earlier, now limped through hostile waters toward what would become her final appointment with destiny. HMS Exeter was a York-class heavy cruiser, one of the Royal Navy's most capable fighting ships. Launched in 1929, she displaced approximately 8,600 tons fully loaded and measured 570 feet in length. Her main armament consisted of 6 8-inch guns mounted in 3 twin turrets, designated A, B, and Y from bow to stern. Secondary armament included 4 4-inch anti-aircraft guns and multiple smaller weapons. She could make 32 knots at full speed and carried a complement of approximately 630 officers and men. Exeter had earned immortality in December 1939 when, alongside the light cruisers HMS Ajax and HMS Achilles, she engaged the German pocket battleship Graf Spee off the coast of Uruguay in the Battle of the River Plate. Despite being heavily damaged in that engagement, with A turret destroyed and severe casualties, Exeter had fought with such determination that Graf Spee's captain chose to scuttle his ship rather than face another battle. The victory had been a tremendous propaganda coup for Britain in the early months of the war, and Exeter had become a household name throughout the Commonwealth. But now, in the desperate early months of 1942, as Japan's military machine rolled across Southeast Asia with seemingly unstoppable momentum, the situation had changed catastrophically. Hong Kong had fallen on Christmas Day, 1941. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable fortress, had surrendered on February 15th with 85,000 troops marching into captivity. The Japanese were landing on Java, the last major Allied stronghold in the Dutch East Indies. The war in the Pacific had become a nightmare of unbroken defeats. 2 days earlier, on February 27th, Exeter had participated in the Battle of the Java Sea, a desperate attempt by the combined American-British-Dutch-Australian Naval Command to intercept and destroy a Japanese invasion convoy approaching Java. The multinational force, commanded by Dutch Rear Admiral Karel Doorman, consisted of 5 cruisers and 9 destroyers facing a superior Japanese force. The battle had raged for 7 hours across the darkening sea, and it had been an unmitigated disaster for the Allies. During that chaotic engagement, Exeter had been hit by an 8-inch shell from the Japanese heavy cruiser Haguro. The shell had penetrated the starboard aft section and exploded in B boiler room, knocking 6 of her 8 boilers offline and killing 14 men. The ship's maximum speed had been drastically reduced. Captain Oliver Gordon had been forced to turn his ship out of the battle line and limp back to Surabaya for emergency repairs. The Battle of the Java Sea had ended in complete defeat. Admiral Doorman had gone down with his flagship, the Dutch light cruiser De Ruyter. The light cruiser Java had also been sunk. The Allied fleet had been shattered, unable to prevent the Japanese landings. Now the survivors faced a terrible choice: remain in Java and be captured when the island fell, or attempt to escape through Japanese-controlled waters. Following the catastrophic defeat at the Java Sea, The remnants of the ABDA fleet received orders to withdraw from the doomed Dutch East Indies. Individual ships were to make their way to safety as best they could. HMS Exeter, still battle-damaged and capable of only limited speed, was ordered to proceed to Colombo, Ceylon, for extensive repairs. To reach the Indian Ocean, she would have to transit the Sunda Strait, the narrow passage between Java and Sumatra. This presented an enormous problem. The Sunda Strait and all waters around Java were now patrolled by victorious Japanese naval forces. The Japanese knew Allied ships would attempt to escape and had positioned powerful surface groups to intercept them. For Exeter, wounded and slow, the passage would be extraordinarily dangerous. At Surabaya, engineering crews worked frantically to make temporary repairs. They could not fix the damage to B boiler room, leaving Exeter with only 2 boilers operational. On February 28th, the crew conducted a burial at sea for the 14 men killed in the battle, conducting the ceremony with full naval honors despite the desperate circumstances. Exeter would not sail alone. The British destroyer HMS Encounter, a vessel of 1,350 tons mounting 4 4.7-inch guns, would accompany her. Also joining the escape attempt was USS Pope, an American destroyer of similar size and armament. These 2 destroyers represented the sum total of escort Exeter would have against whatever Japanese forces they might encounter. The small Allied flotilla slipped out of Surabaya harbor on the evening of February 28th. They headed north, intending to transit the Java Sea westward before entering the Sunda Strait. It was a dangerous route through waters now controlled by the Imperial Japanese Navy. Captain Gordon initially could only make 15 knots, but superb work by the engineering staff managed to get 2 more boilers operational, and by midnight the ship's speed had increased to 23 knots. The Japanese Southern Force, tasked with supporting the invasion of the Dutch East Indies, included some of the most powerful warships in the world. 4 heavy cruisers of the Myoko class prowled the waters north of Java: Nachi, Haguro, Myoko, and Ashigara. Each of these ships displaced over 13,000 tons and mounted 10 8-inch guns in 5 twin turrets. They could make 35 knots. Their armor was substantial, and their fire control systems were excellent. Each cruiser also carried reconnaissance floatplanes that could search vast areas of ocean. Supporting these heavy cruisers were numerous destroyers, including Akebono, Inazuma, Yamato, and Kawakaze. The Japanese had essentially complete control of the waters around Java. Through the night, the 3 Allied ships steamed through the Java Sea. They encountered one enemy force during darkness but managed to evade detection. As dawn approached on March 1st, tension aboard all 3 ships mounted. Daylight would make them visible to Japanese search planes and surface patrols. At approximately 7 o'clock on the morning of March 1st, 1942, lookouts aboard HMS Exeter spotted topmasts on the northern horizon. Within minutes, the masts resolved into the upper works of large warships. The Japanese had found them. By 8 o'clock, the enemy ships had resolved into distinct silhouettes. 2 large cruisers were visible, identified as heavy units. One of them launched reconnaissance floatplanes. Captain Gordon immediately ordered increased speed, but Exeter could make only about 26 knots with her damaged machinery. The Japanese cruisers, capable of 35 knots, began closing the distance. Realizing that his small force was in no condition to fight a prolonged engagement against superior forces, Gordon turned Exeter north, hoping to evade. For approximately an hour, the Allied ships attempted to shake off their pursuers. But then, disaster struck. 2 more Japanese heavy cruisers appeared on the horizon to the northwest, accompanied by destroyers. Exeter had run directly into another enemy force. The British cruiser was now caught between 2 groups of Japanese heavy cruisers. Gordon had no choice but to turn back east and attempt to fight his way through. There would be no escape. The Japanese had overwhelming superiority in numbers, firepower, and speed. At approximately 9:30, the Japanese cruisers opened fire at long range. The range was approximately 20,000 meters. Exeter replied with what guns she had operational. The battle had begun. The engagement opened with long-range gunnery. The Japanese cruisers, positioned both north and south of Exeter's course, could bring overwhelming firepower to bear. Exeter fired back with the turrets she still had operational, her gunners aiming carefully despite the difficult tactical situation. For nearly 2 hours, a running battle ensued across the Java Sea. The Japanese cruisers maneuvered to maintain their advantageous position, firing steadily at the British cruiser. Exeter was straddled many times, massive columns of water rising around her as 8-inch shells fell short and over. Through skillful ship handling, Captain Gordon managed to avoid hits for a considerable time. HMS Encounter and USS Pope attempted to provide support, laying smoke screens to obscure Exeter from enemy gunfire. The destroyer's smaller guns were largely ineffective against the heavy cruiser's armor, but their crews did everything possible to help the crippled cruiser. The Japanese forces divided to envelop Exeter more completely. Haguro and Nachi engaged from one side, while Myoko and Ashigara attacked from the other direction. Exeter found herself taking fire from multiple directions, making evasion increasingly difficult. At approximately 11 o'clock, Exeter was struck by a critical hit. An 8-inch shell penetrated deep into the ship and exploded in the forward boiler room. The result was catastrophic. The explosion destroyed what remained of Exeter's operational boilers and knocked out electrical power throughout the ship. Steam pressure dropped to nothing. The engines stopped. Exeter's speed fell away rapidly. Within minutes, the ship was making only about 5 knots, barely maintaining steerage way. She had become essentially a stationary target. The Japanese cruisers closed in, reducing range to approximately 10,000 meters. At approximately 11:20, another devastating hit struck the ship. This shell destroyed Exeter's electrical power systems and disabled her remaining operational guns. The cruiser could no longer fight back effectively. Fires raged throughout the ship. More shells continued to strike the hull and superstructure. Just before noon, with his ship dead in the water, fires burning out of control, electrical power gone, and guns silenced, Captain Gordon made the inevitable decision. At approximately 11:30, he gave the order to abandon ship. The order to abandon ship was passed throughout Exeter by voice and messenger, as the electrical communication systems had failed. The crew, many wounded and exhausted, began the final duties with discipline and professionalism. Secret documents and code books were destroyed. Intelligence materials were burned or thrown overboard with weights attached. Radio equipment was smashed to prevent it from falling into enemy hands intact. Engineers opened sea valves to flood the ship's compartments, ensuring she would sink rather than be captured. The white ensign, the battle flag of the Royal Navy, was hauled down. Even as Japanese shells continued to fall, this ceremony was performed with proper dignity. Men began going over the side into the warm waters of the Java Sea. The wounded were helped down first. Lifeboats and rafts were launched. Throughout the evacuation, discipline held. These were Royal Navy sailors, and they would leave their ship properly. As the crew abandoned ship, Japanese destroyers approached to finish off the crippled cruiser. According to some accounts, at least one torpedo from the destroyer Inazuma struck Exeter on the starboard side. The ship, which had been listing to port, was struck to starboard and began to roll in that direction. At approximately 11:40, HMS Exeter rolled heavily to starboard. Her bow rose as water poured into the hull through shell holes and opened valves. The stern settled deeper. For several minutes, the cruiser hung at a steep angle, her battle damage clearly visible. Then, shortly before noon on March 1st, 1942, HMS Exeter slipped beneath the waves. She sank in approximately 60 meters of water, coming to rest on the seabed approximately 90 miles northwest of Berwian Island. The position was later determined to be approximately 7 degrees 12 minutes south latitude, 111 degrees 30 minutes east longitude. Japanese destroyers moved among the survivors in the water, pulling men aboard. Approximately 400 survivors were rescued relatively quickly. Other survivors spent many hours in the water before being picked up by Japanese ships. In total, approximately 651 men survived to become prisoners of war. 54 had been killed in the action or went down with the ship. HMS Encounter attempted to continue fighting, but was quickly overwhelmed by the Japanese cruisers Myoko and Ashigara and the destroyers Kamikaze and Yamato. She was sunk by gunfire shortly after Exeter went down. USS Pope initially escaped but was caught approximately 2 hours later. Aircraft from the Japanese light carrier Ryujo crippled her, and she was finished off by gunfire from Myoko and Ashigara. All 3 ships of the escape attempt had been destroyed. The sinking of HMS Exeter marked the end of Royal Navy heavy cruiser presence in Southeast Asian waters. Japan now controlled the entire Indonesian archipelago. The Battle of the Java Sea and its aftermath had completely eliminated effective Allied naval power in the region. For the surviving crew of HMS Exeter, their ordeal was far from over. Captain Gordon and his men became prisoners of war, transferred to camps at Makassar on Sulawesi. Conditions in Japanese prisoner of war camps were brutal. Starvation, disease, deprivation, and abuse were constant. Of the approximately 650 survivors from Exeter, approximately 1/4 died during captivity. Many succumbed to malnutrition, tropical diseases, and the harsh treatment they received. Captain Gordon survived his imprisonment and brought back detailed records of Exeter's final battle. He had hidden his notes in a tube of shaving cream to conceal them from his captors. These records provided the official account of the ship's last action. The survivors were finally liberated in September 1945 after Japan's surrender. HMS Exeter's final battle exemplified naval courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Outgunned 4-1, damaged and slowed, with no hope of victory or escape, she fought until her guns were destroyed and her hull was shattered. She did not surrender while still capable of resistance. Her crew maintained discipline and professionalism even in defeat. From the River Plate to the Java Sea, HMS Exeter had compiled a battle record marked by courage and devotion to duty. Her last fight, though ending in defeat, upheld the traditions of the Royal Navy during the darkest days of the war. The ship and her crew had done their duty to the last. The wreck of HMS Exeter was discovered by exploration divers in February 2007. She was found lying on her starboard side in Indonesian waters at a depth of approximately 60 meters, some 60 miles from the position Captain Gordon had estimated after the war. In July 2008, HMS Kent conducted a memorial service over the wreck site. 4 survivors of HMS Exeter attended the ceremony. Today, HMS Exeter rests on the seabed of the Java Sea. She is a war grave, protected by international law, the final resting place of the men who fought and died aboard her. Her story remains a testament to naval courage, professional excellence, and the sacrifice of those who serve at sea in wartime. The ship that had defeated Graf Spee, that had carried the pride of the Royal Navy through 3 years of war, had fought her last battle with honor and courage against impossible odds. Just before midnight on November 14, 1942, in the narrow waters of Iron Bottom Sound, a United States battleship was illuminated by Japanese searchlights and struck again and again by heavy shell fire. In roughly 4 minutes, she was hit at least 26 times. She did not sink, and she was not the ship that would decide how the night ended. To understand why, we need to step back half an hour, before the searchlights, before the chaos, before the first American battleship fired a shot. Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo was returning to Guadalcanal with unfinished business. The previous night, Japanese forces had failed to neutralize Henderson Field. That airstrip remained the center of gravity in the Solomon Islands. As long as it operated, American aircraft could strike Japanese transports at daylight. Kondo intended to prevent that. His bombardment force was powerful. Heavy cruisers Atago and Takao formed part of the corps. Several destroyers screened the formation, and with them sailed the fast battleship Kirishima. Kirishima was not a new ship. She had been laid down before the First World War as a battle cruiser and later modernized. She was fast for her size and carried 8 14-inch guns. She had fought in the early Pacific campaigns and had survived. Japanese doctrine favored aggressive night action. Their crews trained extensively for it. Their optics were excellent. Their Type 93 long-lance torpedoes had already proven devastating in previous engagements around Guadalcanal. Darkness, for most of 1942, had favored Japan. Waiting for them was Task Force 64 under Rear Admiral Willis Ching Lee. Lee commanded 2 modern American battleships, USS Washington and USS South Dakota, supported by 4 destroyers deployed ahead as a screening force. Lee was not known for dramatic gestures. He was methodical, a gunnery specialist, an Olympic marksman decades earlier. He believed in controlled fire and precise solutions. Washington carried SG surface search radar and modern fire control equipment. The system allowed detection and tracking of ships in complete darkness. It did not rely on searchlights or visual spotting. If it worked under combat conditions, it would give Lee an advantage the Japanese did not fully anticipate. At approximately 11:15 p.m., radar aboard Washington began reporting contacts north of Savo Island. Moments later, the American destroyers at the front of the formation made contact. The engagement developed quickly. USS Preston was hit by shell fire that penetrated her engineering spaces. Fires spread rapidly. Within minutes, she was sinking. USS Walker was struck by a torpedo forward of the bridge. The explosion caused catastrophic structural damage. She went down soon afterward. USS Benham was hit by a long-lance torpedo that tore open her forward hull. Though she remained afloat temporarily, she was crippled. USS Gwynn took shell hits, but managed to withdraw. In less than 20 minutes, Lee's destroyer screen was shattered. The American battleships were now exposed to direct engagement. Shortly before midnight, another problem emerged, this time aboard South Dakota. A cascade of electrical failures disrupted major systems. Circuit breakers tripped across multiple panels. Radar displays went dark. Internal communications were compromised. For several critical minutes, South Dakota operated with severely reduced situational awareness. In daylight, 6 minutes might pass unnoticed. In a night surface engagement at close range, 6 minutes can determine survival. As power was gradually restored, South Dakota maneuvered to avoid the burning wreckage of the destroyers ahead. In doing so, she turned in such a way that her silhouette stood out against the glow of flames on the water. From the perspective of Japanese ships to the north, she became visible. Searchlights from cruiser Atago snapped on. A beam fixed on her hull. Gunfire followed immediately. For approximately 4 minutes, South Dakota endured concentrated shell fire. After-action reports indicate at least 26 hits by medium and heavy caliber shells. Most damage occurred above the armored belt. Radar antennae were damaged, communication systems were disrupted, fires broke out in sections of the superstructure. Yet the ship remained afloat and structurally intact. Her armor held. More importantly, the majority of Japanese heavy guns were now focused on her illuminated silhouette, including those aboard Kirishima. Amid smoke, flame, and exploding shells, one American battleship had not been illuminated. Washington remained in darkness. On her bridge, Admiral Lee observed radar plots that continued to track multiple contacts. Among them was a larger return, consistent with a capital ship, almost certainly Kirishima. Lee faced a decision. He could open fire immediately and reveal Washington's position, or he could wait. If both American battleships became visible at once, Japanese fire might divide or shift. Lee chose to wait. Radar operators refined the target solution. Range closed steadily to roughly 8,400 yards. The contact remained consistent. Japanese attention remained fixed on South Dakota. From their perspective, they were engaging the American battleship force successfully. In reality, they had located only one of the two. The geometry of the engagement mattered. South Dakota's illuminated position drew fire and attention. Washington, slightly offset and unlit, maintained a clearer firing solution. Lee waited until South Dakota had maneuvered sufficiently clear of his line of fire. He waited until range and bearing stabilized. He waited until firing would achieve maximum effect with minimal exposure. At 12:58 a.m., he gave the order. Washington's 9 16-inch guns fired nearly simultaneously. The concussion rolled across the water. Seconds later, tall columns of water rose around Kirishima. Another salvo followed, then another. Radar-directed fire allowed Washington to engage without illumination. No searchlights revealed her exact position. No star shells announced her presence. The advantage of darkness shifted. Kirishima was now under accurate heavy fire from a source she had not fully identified. Within minutes, the character of the battle began to change. The battleship absorbing 26 hits under searchlights was not the one determining the outcome. That role now belonged to the ship firing from darkness. And in the next several minutes, that distinction would prove decisive. At 12:58 a.m., the first full salvo from USS Washington crossed Iron Bottom Sound. It took only seconds to reach its target. The shells landed close. The next salvo landed closer. Within minutes, the balance of the engagement shifted. But nothing about those minutes was chaotic aboard Washington. They were controlled. Washington was firing at a range of roughly 8,000 to 8,400 yards. For battleships of that size, that was close. Close enough that radar data translated quickly into correction. In the plotting room below decks, operators tracked the target continuously. Range, bearing, course changes. Each salvo produced feedback through radar return and visual splash pattern. Washington's gunnery was deliberate, not rushed, not scattered. The first confirmed 16-inch hit struck Kirishima high in the superstructure. Another shell hit near a forward main turret. Fragments tore through upper compartments. Fire control circuits were disrupted. A third heavy shell struck near the base of the tower structure. The concussion alone was severe. Japanese lookouts struggled to determine where the fire was coming from. South Dakota was still visible under intermittent illumination, but heavy shells were now landing from a different bearing. Kirishima returned fire. Her 14-inch guns answered in the darkness. But without clear optical identification of Washington's position, her salvos lacked precision. The Japanese were experienced night fighters, but their system depended heavily on visual confirmation. Without searchlight illumination on Washington, accurate ranging was difficult. Meanwhile, Washington's secondary 5-inch batteries joined in. They targeted superstructure areas and possible destroyer threats. The effect was cumulative. Within minutes, Kirishima's forward fire control capability was degraded. Reports from Japanese survivors later described heavy shock damage and internal confusion. Then came a critical hit. One of Washington's shells damaged Kirishima's steering gear. Whether by direct penetration or shock effect, the result was clear. The rudder jammed. Attempts to regain steering control failed. The battleship began to veer. A capital ship that cannot hold course becomes unstable as a firing platform. Kirishima started turning in a wide, unintended circle. Her gunners now had to compensate not only for target movement, but for their own uncontrolled rotation. Inside the ship, damage control teams worked under extreme pressure. Pumps were activated. Fires were fought manually. Reports moved upward through disrupted communication channels. Another heavy hit struck near an aft section. Flooding increased. Within roughly 7 minutes of Washington's first salvo, Kirishima was no longer an effective bombardment platform. Her main turrets were partially disabled. Her steering was compromised. Fire control systems were unreliable. She was still afloat, but she was no longer in control. Admiral Willis Lee did not continue firing indefinitely. Shortly after 1:07 a.m., he ordered a ceasefire. The decision was calculated. Washington had achieved tactical neutralization. Continuing to fire risked revealing her exact position more clearly to Japanese cruisers and destroyers. Torpedo threats remained possible. Indeed, Japanese destroyers launched long lance torpedoes toward Washington's last known bearing. Radar operators tracked possible surface movement. Lookouts scanned for phosphorescent wakes. Lee ordered course adjustments. Washington maneuvered deliberately to clear suspected torpedo tracks. No torpedo struck. On Kirishima, the situation deteriorated further. With steering damaged, propulsion adjustments could not fully compensate. The ship continued to circle unpredictably. Fires burned in multiple sections. Water entered compartments that could not be fully sealed. Vice Admiral Kondo, aboard cruiser Otago, now faced a deteriorating tactical picture. His mission had been to bombard Henderson Field. That required time in position and coordinated heavy gunfire. One of his capital ships was now crippled. The American battleships were still afloat, and dawn was approaching. Remaining in Iron Bottom Sound risked exposure to daylight air attack. The longer he delayed, the greater the risk to his entire force. It is important to understand that Washington did not sink Kirishima in those 7 minutes. Battleships rarely vanish instantly. What Washington accomplished was operational elimination. Kirishima could no longer execute the bombardment mission. She could not maintain formation. She could not reliably return accurate heavy fire. In naval warfare, that distinction is decisive. A ship removed from the fight may remain afloat, but its mission is lost. South Dakota, meanwhile, had withdrawn from the immediate engagement area. Though battered above the armor belt, she remained structurally sound. Her damage looked dramatic, but her core fighting strength survived. Japanese gunners had concentrated on the visible target. In doing so, they had failed to identify the unseen threat. Washington had fired from darkness with radar guidance and disengaged before her own exposure became critical. The engagement lasted less than 10 minutes in its decisive phase. 7 minutes of controlled heavy fire. That was enough. As the gunfire subsided, Iron Bottom Sound returned to relative quiet. Smoke hung low over the water. Burning debris drifted. Kirishima continued to struggle. Damage control efforts slowed flooding but could not restore steering. Her captain faced a narrowing set of options. If steering could not be repaired, safe withdrawal would be nearly impossible in restricted waters. Kondo assessed the broader situation. Without Kirishima's heavy guns, the bombardment of Henderson Field would be incomplete and risky. With daylight approaching, the presence of American aircraft would be unavoidable. The decision formed gradually, but clearly. The bombardment would not continue. Washington turned away from the center of engagement. Her hull remained intact. Her main battery was ready if needed again. But Lee's objective had not been destruction for its own sake. It had been prevention. Prevent the bombardment. Prevent Japanese transports from unloading safely. That objective had been achieved. Behind him, Kirishima's fate was becoming a matter of time rather than gunfire. And by dawn, the consequences of those 7 minutes would extend far beyond the loss of a single ship. By the time the eastern sky began to lighten on November 15th, 1942, the decisive part of the battle was already over. Gunfire had ceased. Smoke still drifted across the water. One Japanese battleship was crippled, and Henderson Field had not been bombarded. That last fact would matter more than the loss of any single ship. Shortly after Washington ceased fire, Kirishima continued struggling to regain control. Her steering gear was damaged beyond immediate repair. Engine adjustments could not fully compensate. The ship remained unstable, turning unpredictably in restricted waters. Fires burned in multiple sections of the superstructure. Internal damage control teams fought flooding in several compartments. Electrical systems were unreliable. Fire control coordination had largely broken down. Kirishima was not yet sinking, but she was no longer a functioning battleship. Vice Admiral Kondo, aboard cruiser Otago, now had to evaluate the broader picture. His mission had never been to seek a decisive fleet engagement. It had been to silence Henderson Field. Without that bombardment, Japanese transport ships approaching Guadalcanal would be exposed to American aircraft at daylight. With Kirishima disabled and American battleships still present, remaining in Iron Bottom Sound carried increasing risk. Dawn was approaching, and with dawn would come aircraft. Kondo made the decision to withdraw. It was not dramatic. It was not announced with ceremony. It was simply necessary. Destroyers were detached to assist Kirishima. Efforts continued to stabilize the ship. But as flooding worsened and steering remained inoperative, the outcome became clear. A capital ship that cannot steer in confined waters is vulnerable even without enemy fire. Reports indicated worsening list. Counter-flooding was attempted, but the imbalance increased. As the horizon brightened, the decision was made to abandon and scuttle. Before full daylight, Kirishima was intentionally sunk by her own escorts. She rolled and went down in the waters that had already claimed many ships on both sides. The American battleships did not remain to witness it. USS Washington had already withdrawn from the center of action. She had not suffered major damage. Her main battery was intact. Her radar had functioned as intended. USS South Dakota, though heavily scarred above the armor belt, remained afloat and structurally sound. From a distance, her damage appeared severe. Inside, the core of the ship had survived. The American destroyers had paid a heavy price. 3 had been lost. But the bombardment mission had failed. That was the larger outcome. With Henderson Field still operational, the next phase unfolded quickly. At first light, American aircraft began launching sorties. Japanese transport ships, which had counted on overnight suppression of the airfield, were now exposed. Air attacks followed. Several transports were damaged or destroyed before they could unload fully. Even those that managed to beach or partially disembark did so under increasing pressure. The intended reinforcement of Japanese ground forces on Guadalcanal was severely reduced. The strategic effect became clear over the following days. Without adequate reinforcement and supply, Japanese forces on the island faced mounting difficulty. The night battle had not ended the campaign, but it had altered its trajectory. It is tempting to frame the engagement as a classic battleship duel. In reality, it was something more transitional. Japanese doctrine had emphasized night optics, aggressive maneuver, and torpedo superiority. Those strengths remained real. But radar-directed gunfire introduced a different element. On the night of November 14th to 15th, one American battleship absorbed intense shell fire under searchlights. The other fired accurately without illumination. The difference lay not in courage or training, it lay in detection and fire control. Washington did not rely on visual spotting. Her radar operators provided range and bearing continuously. Her plotting rooms adjusted in near real time. Darkness no longer guaranteed concealment. That shift was gradual across the Pacific War, but Iron Bottom Sound demonstrated it clearly. Admiral Willis Lee did not claim a dramatic victory speech. He had prevented a bombardment. He had neutralized an enemy battleship. He had withdrawn before daylight air threat became decisive. It was a measured operation, and it reflected his temperament. Washington would continue to serve in later campaigns. She would escort carriers and participate in further operations. Yet she would never again face another battleship in quite the same way. The night engagement off Guadalcanal became one of the few instances in World War II where a U.S. battleship decisively disabled an opposing battleship in surface combat. The loss of Kirishima was significant for Japan, but more significant was the failure to silence Henderson Field. Guadalcanal was a campaign of logistics and attrition. Airfields mattered, supply mattered. Each unsuccessful reinforcement attempt weakened Japan's ability to sustain the fight. By early 1943, Japanese forces would withdraw from the island. The chain of events leading there involved many battles, but the night of November 14th to 15th marked a turning point within that sequence. When dawn fully broke over Iron Bottom Sound, there was no ceremony, only scattered wreckage, oil on the water, and ships departing the area. One battleship lay below the surface, another steamed away largely intact, and Henderson Field remained in American hands. 7 minutes of controlled fire had prevented a bombardment. That, more than the sinking itself, defined the battle. In naval warfare, success is often measured not only by what is destroyed, but by what is prevented. On that November night, prevention changed the course of the campaign. By the afternoon of November 15th, 1942, the waters around Guadalcanal looked calm again. There were no battleships in sight, no searchlights cutting across the water, no heavy guns firing across Iron Bottom Sound. But beneath the surface lay another wreck, and ashore, Henderson Field was still operating. That was the true outcome of the night. After Kirishima was scuttled before dawn, Japanese destroyers rescued as many survivors as possible. The battleship had fought in multiple campaigns since the opening months of the war. She had escorted carrier forces, she had supported landings, she had endured modernization and refits, but in Iron Bottom Sound, she had encountered a different form of engagement. Her loss was not the result of a prolonged duel in daylight. It was the result of a brief, controlled exchange conducted largely through radar. Vice Admiral Kondo's bombardment force withdrew northward. The decision had not been dramatic. It had been dictated by time and circumstance. Without Kirishima's heavy guns, and with American battleships still afloat, remaining in confined waters risked further loss. More importantly, dawn meant aircraft. With Henderson Field untouched, American aircraft began launching almost immediately. Japanese transports that had been approaching the island under expectation of night bombardment now found themselves exposed. Airstrikes followed. Several transports were destroyed or crippled before completing their unloading operations. Even those that managed to beach themselves did so under constant threat. The intended reinforcement of Japanese troops was sharply reduced. Guadalcanal had always been a campaign of supply. Ground forces could not sustain operations without food, ammunition, and medical support. Each failed reinforcement attempt narrowed Japan's margin. The naval battle did not end the campaign, but it restricted Japan's ability to continue it. The night engagement also marked a subtle but important transition in naval warfare. For much of 1942, Japanese night fighting skill had proven superior. Optical range-finding, aggressive torpedo tactics, well-practiced formations. These methods had inflicted heavy losses on Allied cruisers and destroyers, but radar-directed gunnery altered the equation. On November 14th to 15th, one American battleship was illuminated and battered under concentrated fire. The other fired from darkness using electronic detection. The difference was not luck, it was systems integration. Washington's radar operators fed continuous data to the plotting rooms. Fire control solutions were calculated without visual confirmation. Salvos were corrected using radar returns and splash patterns. Darkness no longer guaranteed concealment. This did not immediately end Japanese night effectiveness, but it demonstrated that the balance was shifting. Rear Admiral Willis Lee did not pursue a fleeing enemy. He did not attempt to finish off Kirishima at extreme range once she was disabled. He assessed the situation. The bombardment mission had failed. The American objective was achieved. Remaining in Iron Bottom Sound risked daylight air exposure. Washington turned away. It was a measured withdrawal. South Dakota, though damaged above her armored belt, survived the engagement. Her appearance suggested severe destruction. In reality, her vital systems remained largely intact. She would require repairs. But she was not lost. The American destroyers had paid heavily. Preston, Walker, and Benham were gone. Their losses were significant. Yet, in the broader balance of objectives, the Japanese had failed to achieve theirs. The campaign on Guadalcanal continued for weeks. Fighting ashore remained intense. Naval engagements would still occur. But the night of November 14th to 15th demonstrated something larger than the sinking of a single battleship. It showed that radar could offset previous disadvantages in night combat. It showed that controlled, deliberate fire could neutralize a capital ship in minutes, and it showed that preventing an objective can matter more than sinking additional ships. Kirishima's loss was significant for morale and fleet strength, but Henderson Field remaining operational was decisive for logistics. Aircraft continued to launch. Transports remained vulnerable. Japanese reinforcement capacity diminished. By early 1943, Japan would evacuate Guadalcanal. The process involved many battles, many losses, and many decisions, yet Iron Bottom Sound played its part. When historians examine the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, they often focus on the 7 minutes of fire that crippled Kirishima. Those minutes were indeed decisive. But the engagement cannot be reduced to that alone. It included destroyer sacrifice, electrical failure, searchlight illumination, deliberate restraint. It included a commander who chose when not to fire. It included a battleship that endured heavy punishment and remained afloat. And it included a second battleship that used new technology to change the terms of the fight. By the end of November 15th, the sea returned to routine patrols and escort duties. The wreck of Kirishima joined others beneath Iron Bottom Sound. Washington steamed away largely intact. Henderson Field continued operating. There was no ceremony marking the moment, no formal declaration that naval night combat had entered a new phase. But from that night forward, electronic detection and radar-directed fire would play an increasing role in surface engagements. The advantage of darkness was no longer absolute. In the confined waters off Guadalcanal, that shift had already taken place, and it had taken less than 10 minutes to demonstrate.